about calling shoves blind versus blind. Um, okay. Okay. Do you want me to count down a higher number? I did. Oh, in my head, I did. Oh, in real life. Gotcha. Okay. Real, real person speech. Okay. Okay. Three, two, one. Hey guys, this is a video on calling shoves blind versus blind. What's important about this is that we're going to simplify as much as possible the process of making these calls. So we're not going to overanalyze. We're not going to use programs like Sit and Go Whiz that might make things confusing. We're going to keep things short and concise, and most importantly, as simple as possible. Okay, so the first thing we want to consider whenever someone is shoving is a very basic thing, and I'm sure you've all done it before. It's thinking, is it a reg shoving or is it a random shoving? Um, what's really important is that overall in sit and goes, but especially just in poker in general, we never want to think that all regulars are the same player. They are not carbon copies of each other, and it's a very common leak you'll see. But if there's one thing in sit and goes that regulars do pretty much the same, it's shoving from the small blind. So in these situations versus randoms, yes, we can simplify the process and say all regs will basically behave pretty much the same BVB. Because let's be honest, shoving blind versus blind is one of the easiest things to do in the world. So when a player is shoving here, like Dario799, I don't know who he is, but let's just pretend that he is a regular. We will assume that when a regular shoves under 10 big blinds, they're shoving almost 100% of their hands, somewhere between 80 and 100. I would just assume it's pretty much 100, except maybe they min raise aces or something like that. But that's a very easy way to approach this situation versus a regular, because most regulars will behave the same in blind versus blind spots when they're shoving from the small blind. A random, on the other hand, is probably not shoving as much. It's probably because they have a large limping range. And so that's why when a player who's a random limps here, we can shove a lot over their limps from the big blind because they're limping hands that they should be shoving. So now if we assume that this guy is a reg, let's think about the range that we can call his shove here with. So what I'm thinking about here is not all these hands. There's 169 different hands to choose from. What I'm doing though is I'm categorizing them to simplify my choices, almost to treat it like if it was a multiple choice test. You know, if you go to school, it's A, B, C, D. It's easy to pick one of four as your answer instead of one of 169. So I'm trying to simplify that process by creating categories of ranges. So simple examples of some categories. Tens and ace king is one. So anytime you would call with ace king, you should probably also call with tens. You know, the same thing for nines and ace queen, etc., etc. These ones are easier, especially the good hands, because we all know when to call with good hands. What gets difficult is when we're trying to call with hands that are a little bit looser than normal, but we still have to show some restraint, some little bit of tightness. I always kind of think about this as that Three Little Bears story where the porridge is too hot or it's just cold. It's just right instead. When it's really difficult when you're trying to be tight, but you're also trying to be a little bit loose, and you need to find that exact just right middle. For example, when you call with Jack 10 suited in a hand like this, it's a very difficult call because you're trying to call loose by calling with Jack 10 suited, but at the same time, your brain might be telling you, maybe that's too loose. Maybe you shouldn't do that. But there needs to be some type of balance. So that's what I want to provide for you in this video. Four ranges that are really important to me in calling are the 15% range, the 20% range, the 30 and the 50% range. Now, you'll notice that these percentages are probably not exactly right. In fact, it doesn't even matter what we call them. We could call them range 1, 2, 3, and 4 if you want. You can give them girls' names. It really doesn't matter. All we need is an estimate about this range. One important note to make is that these percentages for calling ranges are not the same as the percentages for shoving ranges. You'll notice in the shoving range video that a 30% range is something like a pair, any ace, and two face cards, Jack 10 and higher, and some good suited connectors. And that's why it's really important to make the distinction between 30% shoving range and 30% calling range. Is even though the percentages are technically the same, it doesn't mean that the ranges are the same. So what's important to take out of that is that means you can't go and take your 50% shoving range and apply it to your 50% calling range, because the ranges are comprised of a different 50% of hands. Because when you call, you're looking more towards higher strength hands, like higher card value. But then when you shove, low suited connectors go up in value because you're more likely to suck out because people will call you with high card hands. Okay, so how do we actually apply these ranges when making decisions at the table, BVB? Let's look at this example. Let's pretend that this Dario 799 guy is a regular who's shoving very, very wide here. First of all, I'm interpreting this as the total amount of big blinds that he is shoving. That's the range that I'm seeing here, the amount of big blinds he's shoving. I'm seeing 2,200, which is approximately 9 big blinds. So when I see this, I'm grouping this in a 9 and 10 big blind category for shoving. What's really important to mention here is that I'm not doing true big blinds here. I'm not seeing that the pot is 600. I'm not seeing that technically means the blinds are 200, 400. Therefore, he's shoving 6 big blinds because 2,200 divided by 400 is about 6. I'm not thinking about that. Remember, as a reminder, true big blinds is only when we are open shoving or open folding. That's really important. When someone else is shoving, I'm simply viewing it as normal big blinds. 2,200 is about 9 big blinds. So this, to me, is a 9 or 10 big blind shove. Okay? So when you look at this, 9 and 10 big blind shove is about a 30% calling range. So when I see this player shove here, and if I know that he's somewhat of a regular, I will be calling him with 30%. And that's approximately this range right here. Any pair, any ace, King 8, King 5 suited, Queen Jack, Queen 9 suited, and Jack 10 suited. Now, I'm pretty confident that if you go into a program like Sit and Go Wiz and you put this player on 100%, it would tell you to call with 9-5 suited and Jack Deuce offsuit. But you're not going to be calling with those hands because it's really, really important that you don't call super wide. Even though it may be correct, you don't want to call with those hands because that's going to open up your results to all kinds of swings. And that's what's going to cause a lot of downswings. Sure, it may be plus EV to make a call here with Jack Deuce offsuit if you know the villain is on 100%. But I guarantee you calling there is just going to hurt you in the long run more than it will do you good. So it's really important to recognize, even though we can call wider than 30% here, it's really important that we don't do it. For the sake of sanity, let's not call here with 9-6 of diamonds just because you can. Let's have some type of control when we make our good calls. So versus 7 and 8 big blind range, if he was shoving somewhere at about, what is that, 1750, somewhere in there, you would assume that you can call wider than 30%, and you can. But to simplify this, I'm just going to have you call with 30% again. The real range might be somewhere in the 40% area, but all that's important here is it's 30% and maybe add a couple hands that are a little bit wider than Jack 10 suited. For instance, Jack 9 suited, 10-9 suited, stuff like that. But we don't want to get out of control when we're calling 7, 8, 9, and 10 big blind shoves. When you start getting down to 6 big blinds, that's when we can start opening up our range. And that's when I think versus regulars, even though we can call wider than 50%, heck, we could probably even call 80% here. We're only going to call about 50% of hands because, again, we want to make sure we have control and we're not opening our game up to big, giant swings. The 50% range is about pair and ace, King 5, King Deuce suited. You can think about it as most kings and any suited king. Queen 8, Queen 5 suited, Jack 8, Jack 7 suited, 10-9 suited. Sure, there may be a couple more hands in there like 8-7 suited and stuff like that. But for now, let's just keep it simple and stick to this range right here. Now, for all of these ranges, I would suggest writing these down, recording it on paper and on your desktop, however you do it that makes this work for you. It's not about how I do it or how someone else does it. It's how do you learn best. Take these ranges and make it so you can learn through your own learning method. Okay. So then when we get down to 5 big blinds, we're going to keep it really simple. So if this player was shoving somewhere around 1,250 chips, I would call with any face card and just any reasonably good suited connectors like 7-6 suited and higher. So that could include 9-8 suited, 9-7 suited, 8-6 of diamonds, stuff like that. But it's really important that for 5 big blinds versus regs, we're just thinking any face card because that's the simplest way to make a giant impact on our results. So for 4 big blinds now, so if you shoved about 1,000, even though you technically can call ATC, we're not going to do it quite yet. We're just going to call anything nice. And that's about 80% of your hands. It's anything reasonable at all. 10 deuce suited seems reasonable. Again, any face card, of course, because we could call it for 5 big blinds. And just good suited connectors, 7-6 suited, 7-5 suited, maybe a 9-5 suited, stuff like that. Just use your discretion. Anything nice for 4 big blinds. And for 3 big blinds, when a player shoves about 750 approximate chips here, we're just going to call with ATC. So using these, this will be the simplest way to counteract regulars when they're shoving wide into you. Now, if a random shoves the same amount of X big blinds, whatever that amount is, our ranges are going to be tighter because we're assuming that overall, randoms are not going to be shoving as often as regulars. So for 9 and 10 big blinds versus a random, I would be calling with a tighter range, about 15%. 4s, ace-8, ace-7 suited, king-queen offsuit, king-jack suited. This is the widest I really want you guys to call for about 9 and 10 big blinds, blind versus a random player. I don't ever really want to see you calling wider than this. So for 7 and 8 big blinds, we can call just a little bit wider. 2s, ace-2, king-10, king-9 suited, queen-jack suited. Now, I like this range right here because this is the any pair, any ace calling range. I'm sure you've had a lot of situations where you think, well, I would call with any ace heads up, or I would call with any pair in this situation. It's really important to recognize that king-10, king-9 suited, and queen-jack suited are all part of the any pair, any ace family. I have always, like a dork, kind of considered this the mom and dad, and then these are the kids. They're all part of the same family. As with any range, it's all a family of hands. It's a category of hands. And so it's up to us to recognize who the members of this family are. It's really important. So continuing, for 6 big blinds here versus a random player, I would call with about the 30% range we've already discussed. Same thing with 5 big blinds. You can notice the similarities here. 2 30% back to back, 2 30% here. For 4 big blinds, I would call with about half my hands. And again, just to simplify it, for 3 big blinds, you should be basically calling ATC versus anyone. It's just a pot odds thing. It's really important, and it's super easy to do, and it helps with your results. So let's look at another hand here. It folds around to the villain in the small blind, and he shoves 10 big blinds. This is really important. But the difference between this hand and the last one is here, notice that villain and hero both had exactly the same stack. Here, though, you're in a situation where the villain has more chips than you have. That's really important because when I'm thinking about how many big blinds am I calling here, I'm thinking about it differently. In the first hand, I was saying, well, if villain shoves 2250, then I'm thinking about it as 9 big blinds, easy game. But in this hand, since he's shoving more, I'm not thinking about it as he's shoving 10 big blinds. That's really important. In this hand, I'm thinking about it from my perspective, since in here, hero is the shorter stack of the 2 people. And obviously, when you're shorter, you can call wider. So how I'm figuring this out here, the question is, if you have a smaller stack, I should say a smaller stack than the shover, how do you figure out how many big blinds you are calling? Okay, I'm looking at 7 normal big blinds behind plus the 1,000 I have posted. So when I'm calling here, I'm calling 8 big blinds. I'm sure some players think about this differently than me, but this is always the simple kind of tool that I've used to figure out how much I'm calling here. So it's my stack in normal big blinds plus the 1 big blind I posted, I'm calling 8 big blinds here. So let's pretend that this guy was a regular here. I'm calling 8 big blinds. I would come down to here, and I would call about 30%. If this guy was a random, I would take my 8 big blinds, I'd come down here, and I'd call about 20%. So here, versus a random player, this would be my calling range here. And versus a reg, this would be my calling range. Cool. So with that said, it's really important that we just think about how we're always figuring out the amount of big blinds we're calling. As a reminder, we're not thinking in true big blinds. If we're the shorter stack, we're using our stack size plus our big blind that's posted. And if you're similar stack, or if you're the bigger stack of the two, we're simply looking at the total amount that the player is shoving. Cool. So hopefully this is something that can help you in your games when you're trying to figure out what to call. I've tried to lay this out, a nice little blueprint for you, as simple as possible, so you can start matching the number of big blinds you're calling to the ranges provided, and then get more specific with the hands that fall into each range. One thing that's worth mentioning, though, is stage of the game. Think about it for a sec. If you were going to call wide in one of these two hands, which hand would you more likely want to do it in? I hope you said hand number 1, because in hand number 1, you're so far away from the money that if you lose, it's not as big of a deal as if you lose closer to the money. That's exactly why when you're at final tables, you should tighten your ranges, because losing hurts more. It's kind of a product of ICM. The idea of, oh my God, you're so close to real good money, and now you're going to blow it on a call. You probably shouldn't. But at this point in the game, you have so far to go. Now, at this point in the game at Big Blind 1000, you still have a ways to go until the money, but you're a lot closer. So earlier in the game, it's not as bad if you make a calling mistake. But remember this, it's really important advice. If you make a bad shove, it's never that big of a deal, because you have two forms of ways to make money, two forms of equity. Showdown equity, but more importantly, folding equity. It means two sources of income, basically. You could think about it as showdown income and folding income. But when you call, you only have one source of income, and that's the showdown income. You can't make people fold anymore. So what that means is that if you're shoving, it's okay to make mistakes, because you have two ways of making money. If you make a bad call, it's a lot bigger of a mistake. So my advice to you is, if you don't know something is a call, you probably shouldn't make it. That's really, really important. So I'll say that again. If you don't know something is a call, if you are unsure, if this player right here shoves into you and you don't know, you should always fold. Now, in this hand, we happen to know, or at least Hero has informed me, that the villain here is a reg. So let's see how this would work. Villain shoves. How many big blinds are we calling? Okay, we have, since we're the shorter one, we have our 7 big blinds plus the 1, so that's 8 big blinds. We would come over here, and we would call 30%. So this is the worst hand I would call with here. Now, remember before, about 5 minutes ago, I said, you might be able to add a few more hands in here. And that's exactly what Hero did here. He extended Jack 10 suited to Jack 10 offsuit versus this wide regular, and he called. And villain turned over 10 deuce. So even though I may have folded here and called a Jack 10 suited plus, it doesn't mean that I've made a huge mistake. It just means that I've missed out on something a little bit good. Now, what's really important, remember in the beginning of the video I mentioned, Sit and Go Wiz and other programs will tell you you can call really, really wide here. We could probably call this guy with 10-7 suited here, like insta. But are we really going to do that? Because that's what can make your game spiral out of control. And so to counteract that, we're going to be calling tighter than what's suggested by Sit and Go Wiz and other programs. But we will be calling somewhat loose, because we can't just fold like a baby all the time. Remember, it's like the 3 little bears, right? You can call too wide or you can call too tight. But we're going to call somewhere in the middle that's just right. So that's really important. So to end the video on some simple advice, always pay attention to how many normal big blinds a player is shoving, okay? What's really important here is that when you see people shove greater than 10 normal big blinds, it's usually a stronger hand than normal. So for instance, if we go back and we look at this hand, and villain is shoving 20,000, that to me looks like a stronger hand than normal, with the exception if the player is a regular. Because I think a lot of regulars can understand the simple idea of effective stack sizes. I think a lot of regulars will be able to look at your stack and see 7 or 8 big blinds and shove accordingly. But then randoms, on the other hand, they don't see that as often. They'll see 20 big blinds in their stack at 20,000 chips and see the opportunity to min raise a lot, to limp a lot, to 3x a lot. So they'll be shoving less often with that stack size. So my advice to you is be careful of large stack size shoves, especially from randoms, because those are the players most likely don't understand effective stack size shoves. Text message. So the last thing for some simple advice, think in normal big blinds. I've said it before, but it's very important to mention again. Think in normal big blinds because it'll be much easier this way. We don't want to think about these situations as true big blind spots. Because that can mess you up. If we look at the pot size, it's 2,200. The true big blind of that is about 1,500. So technically, you have about 5 or 6 true big blinds, but that'll mess you up. The good news is, and I'm happy to say this, after he shoves, it's hard to know what the initial pot size was. So it'll stop you from recognizing true big blinds. So that's really important. And that's one of the reasons that I use normal big blinds here, because it's way too hard to go, oh, there's 11,000 in the pot now. What was in the pot before he shoved? It's way too confusing. So I just think about it as normal big blinds. In this hand, since we have about the same stack as villain, I'm just seeing that as 9 big blinds. So it groups into 9 and 10 big blinds. If he was a reg, I'd call about 30%, which is that range right here. And then here, since we're shorter, as a reminder again, I'm seeing my 7 big blinds plus the big blind I have out and calling accordingly if I think he's a reg or a random. So let's say here, to end the video, let's say we have 15,000 here. I would be seeing this as a 10 normal big blind spot right here. Now, one last thing to mention. If I have 15,000 and he's shoving 10,000, I have to think about this as if I'm calling 10 big blinds. Even though I only have 9 more big blinds to call, I'm thinking of he's shoving 10 big blinds, therefore my range is, and then act accordingly. So I hope this helped, and if you have any questions, post them in the forum. Best advice I can give you from all this, make sure you write this down in the way that will help you most. All right, good luck.